5 years after I lost my husband, I thought I had finally learned how to recognize the quiet moments that mattered. That Friday in Milwaukee was supposed to be one of them. I closed my bookkeeping office a little after 5, turned off the lights, checked the front door twice, and stood for a moment beside the desk where I had spent 27 years building a business with Daniel. 43 small businesses depended on us for payroll, invoices, and the numbers they did not have time to understand. I had never thought of myself as wealthy. I had simply worked for a long time, saved carefully, and built something steady. Michael was waiting outside. My son was 36, lived close enough to stop by without planning it, and had become the child I saw most often after Daniel died. Rachel, my daughter, had moved to Tampa a few years earlier. Michael was the one who fixed the loose cabinet door, carried heavy boxes, picked up groceries when I was sick, and reminded me when the furnace needed servicing. He had made himself useful in 100 ordinary ways. That was why I trusted him. When I told a friend, "If anything ever happens to me, Michael knows where everything is," at the time, I meant it as reassurance. I did not know that I was describing the very thing that would later put me in danger. The next morning, Michael drove me to the airport. He handled my suitcase, reminded me to keep my phone charged, and checked my boarding information before I went through security. Nothing about him seemed frightened or suspicious. If anything, he seemed unusually calm. I looked back at him before walking away. He smiled. I smiled. I thought I was leaving Milwaukee for a few days of sunshine. I did not know I was leaving behind the life I had spent decades building. The flight to Florida took a little over 3 hours. As the plane moved south, the gray Milwaukee sky disappeared beneath the clouds. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to think that maybe Michael was right. Maybe I had been working too much. Maybe I really did need to slow down. I thought about Rachel and imagined surprising her with lunch. I thought about Daniel and the way he used to say that I could turn even a simple trip into a project. By the time we landed, the sun was low over Florida. I collected my suitcase and walked outside. I expected Michael to be waiting. He wasn't. I called him. Voicemail. I waited a few minutes and called again. Voicemail. 20 minutes passed. Then I looked more carefully at the itinerary he had given me. The address was printed beneath the flight information. I assumed it was the address of the hotel. It wasn't. I handed the paper to an airport employee and asked him if he knew the location. He read the address twice. Then he looked at me. He told me it was not a hotel or a resort. It was an assisted living and memory care facility. For a moment, I thought he had made a mistake. I checked the paper again. Then I checked my phone. Then I looked at the suitcase my son had packed for me. That was when the first real question entered my mind. Why would Michael send his mother to a memory care facility when he had told her she was going on vacation? I still did not know the answer, but I was about to learn that the trip had never been a vacation at all. The first thing I noticed about the place was how quiet it was. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you lower your voice without knowing why. I was standing outside the assisted living and memory care facility with my suitcase beside me, still holding the itinerary Michael had given me. The address was printed clearly on the page. I checked it again, hoping I had somehow read it wrong. I had not. The taxi driver had already left, and the automatic doors opened in front of me. I walked inside. A receptionist looked up, checked a computer screen, and then smiled as if she had been expecting me. She knew my name. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. Michael had arranged everything before I even left Milwaukee. The receptionist explained that my room was ready and that my belongings could be delivered shortly. She showed me a folder with my medication list, emergency contact information, and a schedule that had already been prepared. My room number was already assigned. There was even a small label on the medication container with my name printed on it. Then she mentioned the cost. Michael had paid $68,400 in advance for 12 months of care. 12 months. I stood there trying to understand what I was hearing. A vacation had dates. A vacation had a return ticket. A vacation did not require someone to prepay nearly $70,000 for a year of supervised living. That was when the first real crack appeared in the story Michael had told me. The receptionist seemed uncomfortable when I asked why I was there. She explained that my son had been very concerned about me. According to the information he had provided, I had been forgetting to pay bills, getting confused while driving, forgetting medication, and sometimes forgetting conversations I had just had. I listened without interrupting. Then I started noticing the details around me. My medication was listed correctly. My emergency contact was Rachel. My business address was correct. My phone number was correct. Even my next payroll deadline was written in the notes I had brought with me. I opened my calendar on my phone and checked the week. I knew exactly what day it was, exactly where my employees were working, and exactly which clients needed payroll processed the following Monday. None of that seemed to matter to the story Michael had already told. A nurse named Nora came in a few minutes later. She was polite, professional, and clearly cautious. I could tell she had been given a report about me before I arrived. At first, she asked simple questions about whether I knew where I was and why I had come to Florida. I answered each one. Then she checked something in my file. That was when I noticed the date. The paperwork said I had been diagnosed with cognitive impairment 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks. I remembered those 6 weeks very clearly. I had been in Milwaukee. I had been at my office. I had processed payroll for 3 clients. I had met my accountant. I had gone grocery shopping. I had spoken with Rachel on Sunday. And I had not seen the doctor whose name appeared on the document. I asked where the diagnosis had come from. She did not answer immediately. She looked back at the file. That small pause told me more than an explanation would have. A few minutes later, the receptionist returned with an envelope. It had my name on it. Michael had left it for me. I opened it slowly. The letter began with an apology. Michael wrote that he was sorry, that he had not known what else to do, and that he believed he was protecting me from a life I was no longer capable of managing on my own. He wrote that I did not realize how much I had been declining. Then he wrote one sentence that stayed with me. I've already taken care of the business side of things. I read it twice. The business side of things. My business. The company Daniel and I had built from a tiny office into something that had supported our family for 27 years. I called my office. One of my employees answered. I asked what was happening. There was a pause. Then she told me Michael had said I was retiring. I had never told anyone I was retiring. Not my accountant, not my employees, not Rachel, not even Michael. I sat down in the facility's small waiting area and looked at my suitcase beside me. That suitcase had been packed for a vacation, but suddenly every item inside it looked different. The medication, the clothes, the documents, the phone charger, the careful way Michael had checked everything before I left Milwaukee. I finally understood that Florida was never the destination of a vacation. It was the destination of a plan, and whatever Michael had been doing with my life, he had started doing it long before I ever boarded that plane. I did not leave the facility that night. I stayed in the small guest area with my suitcase beside me because I needed to understand what had happened before I made another decision. The letter from Michael was still in my hand. The sentence about my business kept running through my mind. I've already taken care of the business side of things. I called Ethan Cole, the attorney who had helped Daniel and me with our business for years. I explained where I was, what Michael had told the facility, and what I had just learned about my office. Ethan did not tell me everything would be fine. He did not promise that he could fix it that afternoon. He simply told me to keep every document, take photographs of every page, and not sign anything else. Nora helped me find a quiet room where I could make the calls without being interrupted. First, I called my accountant, then my bank, then the manager at my office. Each call gave me another piece of the same problem. My accountant told me Michael had recently asked questions about transferring ownership of the company. The office manager told me Michael had been speaking as if I were already preparing to retire. My bank told me there had been several unusual transactions and requests for information. Then Ethan called me back. He had found something that frightened me more than the money. The house I had lived in since Daniel and I bought it was being prepared for a possible sale. I remember looking around that little room and trying to connect that fact with the vacation Michael had promised me. A vacation did not require my house to be prepared for sale. A vacation did not require my company to be prepared for a change of ownership. And a vacation certainly did not require a memory care facility to have 12 months of my care paid in advance. Ethan began looking through the records I had photographed. That was when he found the document, a durable financial power of attorney. My name was on it. So was my signature. I remembered signing it 3 years earlier, not long after Daniel died. I had been exhausted, overwhelmed, and still trying to understand how to manage everything alone. Michael had offered to help with practical matters. The document was supposed to allow him to handle certain financial responsibilities if I was hospitalized or unable to manage them myself. I had trusted my son. I had not understood how much authority I was giving him. That distinction suddenly mattered. Ethan explained that the document did not give Michael permission to simply take whatever he wanted or make every decision about my life, but it had given him access and authority that could become dangerous if he used them outside the purpose for which I had signed. Then he gave me the numbers. My total assets were worth roughly $1.46 million. Michael had already attempted to control or move about $817,000. Some of it was connected to the business, some involved savings. There were unusual retirement account transactions, a loan connected to money he had been trying to move, and a deposit tied to the real estate transaction involving my home. I felt sick when Ethan explained that some of the documents contained my real signature. That was the part I had not expected. Michael had not needed to forge every document. He had found a way to use something I willingly signed against me. And suddenly I understood the real betrayal. He had not stolen my signature. He had taken the trust behind it. Nora came back into the room later that evening. She told me something I had not known. Michael had visited the facility before I arrived. He had asked detailed questions about whether I could make my own decisions, whether I could sign documents, and whether I could speak privately with people outside the facility. That meant he had not simply brought me there because he was worried about me. He had been checking what I could still control. Nora did not know the financial details, but she remembered the questions clearly. I asked her to write down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. I took another photograph of the letter Michael had left me, then another of the power of attorney, then the documents from the facility.
I had spent my whole adult life keeping careful records for other people. Now, for the first time, I was doing the same thing for myself. Ethan called again before the evening was over. His voice was calm, but the message was not. We don't have to prove everything today. We need to stop the next thing he is about to do. That was when I understood what came next. I could worry about getting back the money later. I could deal with the house later. I could deal with the business later. First, I had to stop Michael from taking anything else.
The first thing I noticed about the message was that it came from a number I did not recognize. It arrived while I was still sitting in the small room at the facility with Ethan on the phone and copies of Michael's documents spread across the table. The message was short. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you need to know what your son asked our office to do." The sender identified herself as an employee at a local title company. I read the message twice before I forwarded it to Ethan. He told me not to reply yet. The title company employee explained that Michael had been trying to move forward with a real estate transaction involving my house. The company had received documents and instructions connected to the transaction, but one of the required signatures did not match the records they had on file. That small problem had stopped the transaction. Ethan immediately asked the employee to preserve every document, email, and instruction connected to the transaction. He wanted a complete record before anyone changed or withdrew anything. For me, the news was difficult to absorb because the house was not simply an asset. It was the place where Daniel and I had raised our family. It was where Michael had grown up. It was where Rachel had left for college with 2 overpacked suitcases. I had spent years paying the mortgage, maintaining the property, and keeping it exactly as Daniel and I had built it. Now, Michael was trying to put it on the market while I was being kept in a facility he had chosen for me. That was when I realized I could no longer keep Rachel out of this. I called my daughter. I told her I was in Tampa. I told her I had not come for a vacation. Then I told her Michael had arranged for me to stay at an assisted living and memory care facility, and that Ethan had discovered financial activity involving my business, my house, and my accounts. I could hear the change in her breathing. Rachel lived only about 18 or 20 minutes away by car. She was at work when I called, so it took her about 25 minutes to reach the facility. She did not arrive like someone in a movie who suddenly solved everything. She walked through the doors carrying her purse, saw me sitting there with my suitcase, and came straight to my side. That mattered to me. She did not speak for me. She did not argue with the administrator. She simply stayed beside me while I handled what had to be handled. The administrator explained that they needed to verify my situation before releasing me. Nora was there too, and she told them again that I had been alert, oriented, and able to communicate clearly. Ethan joined the conversation by phone. I explained where I was, why I had come, and what I understood about the documents Michael had provided. I made it clear that I understood the facility had been acting on information supplied by my son, but I had not agreed to remain there. I knew my name, I knew the date, I knew where I was, I knew why I had been brought there, and I understood that I had the right to decide where I would live. That was enough. I packed my suitcase. Rachel stood beside me. Nora watched as I walked out through the same doors I had entered less than a day earlier. No one rescued me. I left because I still had the right to make my own decisions. Outside, I felt the Florida heat on my face. Rachel was quiet as we walked to her car. I still had not told her everything I was afraid might happen. Then my phone rang. Michael. For a few seconds, I simply looked at his name on the screen. I answered. His first question was simple. Mom, where are you? That question told me something important. He did not know that I knew. He did not know about Ethan. He did not know about the title company. And he did not know that I had already left the facility. I could have confronted him right there. Instead, I gave him the smallest answer possible. I'm fine, Michael. His voice changed almost immediately. He began asking where I was, who I had spoken to, whether I had talked to an attorney, and what I had been told at the facility. He was no longer asking because he was worried about my health. He was trying to find out how much I knew. I said very little. When the call ended, I looked at Rachel. Neither of us needed to say what we were thinking. Michael was afraid. Later that evening, Ethan received another message from the title company. Michael had come back with another request for another transaction. This time, he had made a mistake. And for the first time since I landed in Florida, I had something Michael did not know I possessed. Time. By the time Rachel and I reached her apartment, I had stopped thinking about the money as something that belonged only to the future. Michael had already started moving pieces around. Ethan had asked me to stay somewhere safe and keep every document I could find. Rachel cleared a space at her kitchen table, and for the next several hours, that table became the place where we reconstructed what had happened. My accountant joined us by phone. Ethan had the bank records, the business documents, and the information from the title company. I had my own memories, calendars, old emails, and files I had kept for years. That last part mattered more than I expected. Michael had assumed that because he was using information I had trusted him with, I would not remember the details behind it. He was wrong. I knew when certain clients had paid us. I knew when our business insurance had been renewed. I knew which accounts belonged to the company and which belonged to me personally. I knew the approximate value of the house. I even remembered conversations with Daniel about retirement accounts that Michael had never been part of. We started building a timeline. At first, it looked like a collection of unrelated events. Then the dates began to line up. The first important date was 11 months before the vacation Michael had arranged for me. That was when he had contacted my accountant asking about the value of my bookkeeping business. He had not said he was preparing to take it over. He had asked about valuation. Then came questions about the house. Then questions about my retirement accounts. Then inquiries about the cost of assisted living in the Tampa area. That last one stopped me. He had been researching assisted living months before he told me I needed a vacation. The care facility had not appeared suddenly because Michael became worried about me. It had been part of his planning. We continued through the financial records. The $817,000 did not appear as one large transfer. That would have been easier to see. Instead, the money moved in pieces. Some transactions were connected to debts Michael had accumulated through his own business. Others involved credit card balances and a loan. Another portion moved through an LLC connected to him. There were also payments described in ways that could have looked ordinary at first glance, including expenses presented as family-related costs. But when we placed the transactions beside the dates and emails, the pattern became harder to ignore. Money had been moving toward problems Michael already had. I kept thinking about the times he had told me he was trying to get his finances under control. I had believed him. Then I found an old email. It was from Michael, written long before the vacation. The message was casual, almost careless. He had written,
When Mom retires, the company will probably come to me. I remembered seeing the email years earlier. At the time, I had dismissed it as something a son might say without thinking. Now it looked different. He had not written that the company might be sold. He had not written that I hoped I would continue running it. He had written as if the company would eventually belong to him. Rachel sat across from me when I read it again. She then told me something I had never heard before. Michael had once complained to her that I always trusted her more. She remembered him saying that he had done more for me than she had because he had stayed close, helped around the house, and handled practical things after Daniel died. I had never realized he had been keeping score. That was when the story became more complicated for me. I did not want to reduce my son to a greedy person who simply saw a pile of money and decided to take it. He had debts, he had financial problems, but the record suggested something beyond debt. He wanted control. He wanted the business. He wanted the house. And somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that because he had been the child who stayed nearby, he deserved more. Perhaps he even believed he was the responsible one. That did not excuse what he had done, but it helped me understand why the betrayal had been so carefully planned. Ethan continued searching through the records. Then he found something that changed the timeline again. There were searches and inquiries connected to guardianship, memory care, durable power of attorney, and transferring assets. They had been made months before Michael ever told me I needed a vacation. That meant the facility was not the beginning of the plan. It was the final step. I looked at the dates again. The financial questions came first, then the property questions, then my retirement account questions, then the research about memory care and guardianship. Only after all of that did Michael start talking about how tired I was. That was the part I could not forget. He had not suddenly decided that his mother was becoming incapable of living alone. He had been building a case for it. And when the money trail began to expose what he had been doing, I understood something else. The most frightening part was not that Michael had planned to take my money. It was that he had spent nearly a year planning how to make me look like someone who could no longer protect it.
I learned the next morning that Michael had realized I was no longer at the facility. I had assumed he would call again and explain everything. Instead, he started moving faster. Ethan showed me copies of messages preserved by people Michael had contacted during the previous weeks. One of those people had helped him prepare paperwork connected to the business and property. Michael had sent an email telling the person to keep the story consistent and not discuss certain details outside the process. He also tried to remove some of his earlier communications, but deleting an email from his own account did not erase records held by the company's server. The copies remained. That mattered because the messages showed something the financial records alone could not prove. Michael had been coordinating different parts of the plan while presenting each part as something separate. At the same time, Nora gave Ethan a written statement about what she had seen before I arrived. She remembered Michael asking whether I would be allowed to make private phone calls. He had asked whether staff should discuss my financial situation with me, and whether I could contact people outside the facility without his involvement. Those details showed what Michael had been trying to control. He was not only arranging where I would live, he was trying to control who I could speak to. For the first time, I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting for lawyers and investigators to tell me what had happened. I started helping them. I went back through my memory, identifying things I knew had actually happened. I remembered a meeting months earlier when Michael had sat with me while I discussed retirement with my accountant. I had said I was not ready to stop working. Michael had been quiet, but I remembered him asking what the business would be worth if I retired. I remembered another conversation about the house. I remembered him asking whether I had considered selling it and moving somewhere smaller. And I remembered one afternoon when he had brought me a document and told me it would make financial matters easier.
I had signed it without reading every page. That memory hurt more than I expected, not because I had been careless once, because I had trusted the person standing across the table from me. I gave Ethan every detail I could remember. Then he found something even more important. One document Michael had used to support the claim that I was no longer mentally capable of managing my affairs contained a timestamp. The timestamp placed the document after Michael already knew I was in Florida. That made no sense. The document was supposed to represent a medical assessment of my condition, but if it had been created after Michael knew where I was, it could not honestly represent an assessment that had supposedly existed before the trip. Ethan asked investigators to look into the medical provider listed on the paperwork. The answer came back quickly. The doctor named in the document had never met me. That changed the investigation. Until then, I had been trying to understand how Michael had used a real power of attorney and financial access to control my property. Now there was a separate question. How had he tried to create a medical story that would make that control look legitimate? The police began gathering records. They requested financial documents and communications. They interviewed employees from my business. They spoke with people at the facility. They examined records connected to the medical provider whose name appeared on the document. I did not watch every step. Most of it happened through Ethan and investigators. But I understood enough to know that the story Michael had built around me was beginning to fall apart under ordinary questions. Who created this document? When was it created? Who supplied the information? Who signed it? Who actually examined me? Those questions were harder to answer than the story Michael had told the facility. A few days later, Rachel and I were sitting in her apartment when a local news report appeared on television. I recognized the building in the footage before I understood why it was there. Michael was being escorted out. He had been taken into custody as the investigation moved forward. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no moment where I stood in front of him and demanded an explanation. I simply watched. Rachel sat beside me. I looked at the television and thought about the boy who had once waited outside my office for me after school. Then I thought about the suitcase he had packed, the facility, the power of attorney, the house, the money, the medical document. All of those things belonged to the same story now. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. For weeks, I had imagined that if someone finally stopped Michael, I would feel relief. Instead, I felt the weight of everything that had happened. The legal case could move forward, the financial records could be examined, the documents could be challenged, but none of those things could erase the fact that my own son had planned to take control of my life. That's when I understood something I had not been ready to admit before. Justice and healing were going to be two completely different journeys.
The trial lasted several days, but I remember the first morning most clearly. I sat beside Ethan while the prosecutor began laying out the records. There was no single document that explained everything. The evidence came piece by piece. The financial records showed the movement of money. The durable power of attorney showed how Michael had obtained access to my finances. The transaction records connected him to the attempts involving my house and business. Then came the medical documentation used to support the claim that I could no longer manage my own affairs. The prosecution did not need to turn my son into a monster. The records were enough. The defense took a different position. Michael's attorney argued that Michael had genuinely believed I was becoming unable to protect myself. They pointed to my age, the power of attorney, and the fact that Michael had been the child living closest to me. They suggested that what looked like control could have been an attempt to protect his mother. I listened carefully. Part of me wanted to reject every word. Another part remembered the Michael I had known for most of his life, the son who carried groceries into my kitchen and fixed things around the house after Daniel died.
That was what made the trial difficult. I was not listening to a stranger explain why he had betrayed me. I was listening to someone describe my son. On the second day, Nora testified. She explained what she had seen before I arrived at the facility. She told the court that Michael had already been asking about my ability to make decisions. He wanted to know whether I could speak privately with people outside the facility and whether I could make decisions without his involvement. Nora also described how I behaved when I arrived. I knew where I was. I knew why I was there. I knew who my children were. I understood what was happening. Most importantly, I could clearly tell people what I wanted. Her testimony contained no dramatic accusations. She simply described what she had observed. That made it harder to dismiss. On the third day, the doctor named in the medical paperwork appeared through the proper legal process. He denied ever meeting me. That single fact changed the room. The document used to make me look incapable was no longer simply questionable. The person whose name appeared on it said he had never examined me. I watched the attorneys review the paperwork again. For months, Michael had built a story around my supposed decline. Now, one of its central pieces could not stand. Rachel testified after that. She did not make a speech about what a terrible brother Michael had been. She answered questions. She explained that we spoke every week. She told the court that I was still running my bookkeeping business and had never told her I wanted assisted living. She also confirmed that Michael had sometimes been resentful about the relationship between us. Her testimony was simple. That was enough. Then came the moment I had imagined many times. Michael looked across the courtroom at me. He did not cry. He did not make a scene. He simply looked at me for several seconds, almost as if he were waiting for me to give him some sign. I knew that look. It was the same look he had given me when he was younger, after making a mistake and hoping I would quietly fix it for him. But I could not fix this. Not this time. The verdict came after the evidence and arguments were complete. Michael was convicted. The sentence was 7 years in prison, along with restitution tied to the approximately $718,000 involved in the financial wrongdoing. The court also imposed restrictions intended to prevent him from accessing or controlling my assets and finances, along with appropriate protective orders. I listened without celebrating. The court could return my money, it could protect my house, it could help restore control of my business, it could recognize my right to make decisions about my own life, but there was one thing no verdict could return. 11 months. 11 months during which my son had been quietly planning when I believed he was helping me. 11 months when ordinary conversations had another meaning I did not understand. 11 months when I thought his questions about retirement, money, and my future were signs of concern. I had spent my career working with numbers, and I knew what numbers could prove. They could show when money moved. They could show when documents were created. They could show who had access to an account. But they could not show me why Michael had chosen to do this. That question stayed with me. After the verdict, Michael was allowed one brief moment to speak to me. He looked at me and said, "Mom, I thought I was protecting you." I did not argue with him. I did not tell him he was lying. I simply looked at him and remembered everything that had happened since that airport. Maybe he had told himself that story so many times that he finally believed it. But believing a lie does not make the damage disappear. A courtroom can decide what a person is guilty of. It cannot decide what a mother should feel about her son.
After the trial, I expected life to feel lighter. It did not. For the first few months, I was still waking up and checking my accounts before I made coffee. I had spent so long being told that I could no longer manage my own affairs that I needed to see the evidence with my own eyes. I left the house Daniel and I had shared. Too many memories were tied to it, and I did not want my future to be defined by the place Michael had tried to take from me. I kept the business, but reduced my workload. I reviewed every financial account, changed attorneys, updated my estate plan, revoked the old authority, and put safeguards in place for both my medical and financial decisions. I also made sure that more than one trusted person would know what was happening if I ever became unable to speak for myself. Those changes were not signs that I had stopped trusting people. They were signs that I had finally learned that trust and protection are not opposites. I returned to my work slowly. I no longer wanted to spend every waking hour behind a desk, but I was not ready to walk away from the business I had built. Instead, I reduced my hours and started something I had never imagined doing. I began holding small financial safety workshops for older adults in my community. I taught people how a power of attorney actually works. I showed them how to review their accounts, question unfamiliar transactions, and recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. I told them something I wished I had understood earlier. Being your child does not automatically mean someone should have unlimited control over your life. I did not tell those people my whole story every time. I did not need to. Sometimes I simply watched someone take notes, ask a question, or go home and check an account they hadn't looked at in months. That was enough. Rachel and I became closer, but I was careful not to turn her into the daughter who had to repair everything her brother had broken. She had her own work, her own friends, and her own life. I wanted our relationship to be based on love, not obligation. Months passed before I wrote to Michael. I did not write to tell him that everything was forgiven and forgotten. It wasn't. I wrote because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life carrying what he did. Then I wrote the sentence that mattered just as much. I forgive you because I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying what you did. Those two truths could exist together. I could release the need to punish him in my heart and still keep the boundaries that protected me. 2 years later, I was 63. I worked fewer hours, I had new friends, I joined a community group, I traveled occasionally and sometimes visited Rachel in Florida. I no longer introduced myself as the woman whose son had betrayed her. I was Claire. I was a mother, I was a business owner, I was a woman who had survived something painful and had chosen not to let that pain become the center of the years ahead. One morning in Florida, Rachel and I stood near the ocean. I looked at the water and remembered the first time I had arrived in the state with a suitcase Michael had packed for me. Back then, Florida represented a trap. Now, it was simply a place where my daughter lived, where the sun came up over the water, and where I could stand without being afraid of what was waiting behind the next door. I realized Michael had changed my life, but he had not been given the right to decide what I would do with the life he changed. I had spent years believing that forgiveness meant opening the door again. I know better now. Forgiveness gave me peace. Boundaries gave me safety, and choosing to live again gave me my life back.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.